Mark Henley had never thought of himself as the kind of man who would end up in a planned suburban community, but life had a way of pushing people into situations they had not imagined for themselves, and when his uncle passed away and left him the modest one-story house on the edge of Westbrook Estates, he took it as a quiet sign that perhaps he was meant to start over. Mark had spent most of his adult years working with his hands, restoring old furniture, traveling from job to job without ever really planting roots, and he had grown used to the rhythm of sanding down rough edges, smelling varnish and oil, and feeling the grain of oak or walnut beneath his fingertips. For him, the house was not so much an investment as it was a chance to live in one place long enough to remember what permanence felt like. He arrived in late spring when the air was warm and the trees cast heavy green shadows across the cul-de-sac, and he brought with him very little besides his tools, a battered truck, and a small flock of chickens that he had kept more out of affection than necessity. The birds reminded him of his childhood on his father's farm, a place he had not seen in decades but which lived inside him every time he heard the cluck or saw the flash of the white feathers in the grass. He built them a modest coop in the far corner of the yard, tucked behind a shed that smelled faintly of old paint, and every morning he would scatter grain, listening to the familiar rhythm of their feeding as though it were a soundtrack to something steady in his life. The neighbors seemed polite in the distant, practiced way that people in communities governed by homeowners' associations often were. They waved from driveways, made comments about the weather, and retreated quickly indoors. Nobody came over to introduce themselves at length, and Mark did not push it, since he was not a man who sought company. He spent his evenings refurbishing the oak table he had found in the garage, repairing loose floorboards, and gradually turning the tired little house into something that bore his own quiet signature. Sometimes, though, he would sit outside at dusk, watching his chickens scratch the ground and mutter to each other in the fading light, and he would think to himself that perhaps he had finally built a circle of life that was simple, manageable, and private. That was all he ever wanted, and for the first few weeks, nothing suggested that his peace would be disturbed. The HOA notices that appeared in his mailbox were routine, generic newsletters about recycling or neighborhood watch, written in the kind of bureaucratic language that made everything sound both trivial and faintly menacing at once. He read them without much interest and tossed them into a drawer, not realizing that these small printed warnings were the first shadows of something darker. The chickens became part of the scenery. Even children from the street occasionally stopped to watch them through the fence, fascinated by the way the birds darted and pecked, and Mark, though he never said much, felt a quiet pride in keeping them. He told himself they were harmless creatures, symbols of an older rhythm of life, something that tied him to who he once was. And then, late one evening, as the last of the sunlight leaked across the roof lines, he noticed something odd. One of the hens, a plump Rhode Island red that had always stayed close to the coop, came strutting back from the far side of the yard with a small metallic tag attached loosely to its leg. Mark crouched to take a closer look, frowning at the unfamiliar piece of stamped aluminum. It bore a sequence of numbers and letters he didn't recognize, etched deep enough to suggest it was not a child's prank but something official, something issued. He turned it over in his hand, puzzled, and slipped it into his pocket, glancing toward the silent street beyond his fence. The air had cooled, and the sound of lawn sprinklers echoed from a neighbor's yard, but suddenly the place felt less like a quiet refuge and more like a stage where someone, unseen, was already watching. The morning after he found the tag on the leg of his hen, Mark awoke to the hollow thud of something being slipped into his mailbox, and although he tried to convince himself it was another generic circular from the HOA, a routine reminder about grass length or paint colors, he felt a faint chill when he pulled out a thick envelope stamped in heavy ink with the emblem of Westbrook Estates. He carried it inside, set it on the worn oak table, and opened it with the same careful patience he gave to his furniture work, though his hands betrayed a small tremor as the flap tore. The letter inside was not the bland newsletter he had expected, but an official notice of violation, printed in stark black type that left no room for interpretation. According to the association, he was in breach of covenant restrictions by maintaining livestock, specifically chickens, on his property, and he was being fined $1,200, payable within 30 days, along with a demand that he remove the animals immediately or face escalating penalties and potential legal action. He read the page twice, then a third time, his eyes dragging across phrases that seemed designed to strip away his sense of place. Livestock, prohibited, public nuisance. Failure to comply will result in further enforcement. There was no signature, only the generic name of the compliance committee, and yet the language carried a curiously personal weight, as though someone had written it with him specifically in mind. At first he thought it had to be a mistake, because he had seen other homeowners with dogs that barked long into the night, or cats that wandered freely across the lawns, and his chickens were quiet creatures confined to his fenced yard, bothering no one. He turned the letter over in his hands, scanning for the name of the complainant, but the line that might have carried such information was blank, replaced only by the initials D. Wallace, a name that meant nothing to him, and when he checked the community roster taped to the HOA bulletin board the following afternoon, appeared nowhere among the list of actual residents. It was as though the complaint had been filed by a ghost, someone whose identity had been deliberately concealed or invented. That evening, as he gathered eggs from the coop, he counted one bird short. At first he assumed one of them had slipped into the shed, but after searching the yard with a flashlight, he realized the hen was gone. The gate latch was still secured, the fencing intact, yet the bird had vanished without trace, and he felt the sharp sting of unease as he imagined unseen hands reaching into his small sanctuary. 2 days later, a package appeared on his doorstep, a plain cardboard box with no return address, sealed with heavy tape. Inside, nestled on shredded newspaper, was a collection of eggs, unmistakably from his own flock, their shells still marked with the faint speckles he recognized. But what turned his stomach was the sticker affixed to the inside lid of the box, an official-looking stamp bearing the insignia of the county sheriff's department, accompanied by the words, "Evidence logged." He stood over the open box in the quiet of his kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator loud in his ears, and for the first time he felt something shift beneath his feet, a sense that this was no longer an overzealous HOA clerk trying to enforce bylaws, but a coordinated intrusion that blurred the boundary between neighborhood rules and law enforcement authority. He carried the box outside, set it on the curb, and stared down the empty street, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows to claim responsibility. But no one appeared, and the air remained still. When he returned inside, he spread the notice and the packaging materials across the table, studying them the way he might study the lines of an antique chair, searching for signs of age or craftsmanship. The more he looked, the more deliberate it seemed. The eggs chosen carefully, the insignia printed with official precision, the timing calculated to arrive just as the HOA fine was still fresh in his mind. He thought again of the unfamiliar tag he had found on the hen's leg, the series of stamped numbers, and he realized that this was not random harassment but something more controlled. He began to suspect that the chickens he had thought of as simply his companions were at the center of a larger game, though he could not yet imagine what that game might be. That night he barely slept, lying awake as the faint sounds of feathers rustling in the coop drifted through the open window, and he found himself straining for footsteps that never came. In the morning, he resolved to go directly to the HOA office and demand an explanation, though even as he made the decision he felt the weight of futility pressing against his chest, the awareness that the very people he was about to confront were the ones tightening the noose. The catalyst had been set in motion, and with every detail, the ghost complainant, the missing hen, the stamped eggs, it was clear that his chickens were no longer just animals but a lever someone else intended to use against him. The HOA office sat in a squat building at the edge of the development, wedged between a dry cleaner and a dentist's practice, and as Mark pushed open the glass door with the word Association stenciled across it in peeling gold letters, he felt the same tightening in his chest that he had known before walking into a courtroom years ago during a messy inheritance dispute in his family. The sensation of stepping into a place where the outcome had already been decided and his presence was little more than a formality. The lobby was cold, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes with a few plastic chairs pressed against the walls and a desk occupied by a receptionist whose expression carried the weary disdain of someone accustomed to gatekeeping rather than welcoming. He explained that he had received a violation letter and needed to speak with someone on the compliance committee, and after a long pause in which she did not look up from her monitor, she gestured with 2 fingers toward a hallway. He followed the narrow corridor, hearing the echo of his boots on the tile until he reached a door marked Conference, and when he stepped inside he found 3 people waiting as though they had anticipated him, their postures formal, their smiles absent. At the head of the table sat Linda Harper, the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s with hair pulled into a tight knot and a way of holding herself that suggested not only authority but ownership, as though the entire neighborhood were an extension of her will. To her right was a man he did not know, scribbling notes on a pad without glancing up, and to her left a younger woman who introduced herself as compliance coordinator, but whose voice carried no warmth. Linda motioned for him to sit, folding her hands as though he were a student about to be reprimanded. Mark placed the violation letter on the table and asked as evenly as he could why he was being fined for chickens when the property covenants he had reviewed contained no explicit prohibition, at least not for lots that predated the most recent bylaws. Linda listened without expression, then explained in clipped tones that the rules had been updated 18 months earlier to ensure the community maintained its residential character, and that exemptions for older properties no longer applied. Mark pointed out that he had inherited his uncle's house and that it had been built decades before the association even existed, which meant retroactive enforcement seemed not only unfair but unlawful. The man with the notepad finally looked up, his eyes dull, and murmured that retroactivity was perfectly within their jurisdiction under Section 4 of the revised code. The argument might have ended there in a stale exchange of citations, but then Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice as though confiding something. She said there had already been complaints of the birds wandering outside his yard, scratching near property lines, and that such behavior created hazards, especially after what had happened last year. When Mark asked what she meant, her eyes flicked briefly to the compliance coordinator before settling back on him, and she replied only that certain matters were confidential, but he would not want history to repeat itself. The deliberate vagueness made his stomach tighten. He pressed further, demanding to know the identity of the complainant listed as D. Wallace, insisting that no such resident lived in the neighborhood. Linda's expression hardened, and she answered that the HOA had no obligation to disclose the names of complainants in order to protect them from retaliation, and that if he was unwilling to comply, legal remedies would be pursued. The meeting ended without resolution, leaving Mark with the sour sense of being trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection was distorted to make him appear guilty. He walked out into the sharp sunlight, his head pounding, and returned home to find that another letter had been slipped beneath his door, this one demanding immediate removal of the coop. As he read it, he felt a sudden rush of anger, not because of the fine or the threat of a court, but because the timing was too precise, as if someone had been watching him walk into the HOA office and had prepared the notice in advance, ready to deliver it the moment he returned. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread before him and began to search through his uncle's old files, hoping to find any document that might shield the property from the association's reach. He discovered yellowing deeds, tax receipts, and even a letter from decades earlier that hinted his uncle had once challenged the HOA during its formative years, though the details were vague. The implication, however, was enough to spark both hope and dread. This conflict was not new, and the lines had been drawn long before Mark ever arrived. The next morning, when he went outside to feed the flock, He noticed that the latch on the coop had been tampered with, the metal bent in a way that suggested tools rather than accident, though all the birds were still inside. On the fence post beside the coop hung a thin strip of paper weighted with a small rock. It contained a single line, typed in bold. "Remove them before they are removed for you." He crushed the note in his fist, his jaw tight, and scanned the quiet street. But no one was there, only trimmed lawns and drawn curtains. It was the first undeniable sign that the dispute had moved beyond paperwork and fines into something more invasive. And he understood then that the HOA was not simply enforcing rules, but orchestrating pressure, testing how far they could bend him. Before he broke, the escalation had begun, and though he had no intention of surrendering his birds, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, a slow erosion of safety that left him exposed in his own yard. Mark had grown accustomed to the sense of being watched, the slight pause he noticed when blinds shifted as he walked past a neighbor's house, the subtle silence that seemed to fall over the street when he stepped outside. Yet it was not until he began digging through his uncle's old boxes that he realized the surveillance was not just paranoia but part of a deeper pattern. The boxes had been shoved into the attic, layers of dust thick enough to coat his arms as he dragged them into the light, and inside he found a collection of correspondence between his uncle and the association that stretched back nearly 20 years. Most of the letters were stiffly worded arguments about dues or minor violations, but one packet in particular stood out, marked "confidential" in fading ink. It contained not only complaints about noise and fence heights, but also specific references to unauthorized animals and containment breaches, words that, when read against his current situation, felt less like warnings and more like echoes. His uncle had apparently faced the same accusations decades earlier, though the tone suggested that at the time the board had been uncertain of their legal footing, wavering in their attempts to enforce. What unsettled Mark most was a handwritten note scrawled by his uncle on the margin of one letter. "They only want what they can use." That cryptic sentence lingered in his mind as he continued to search, and late one night he uncovered a manila envelope hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer in his uncle's desk. Inside was a faded photograph of several chickens with small metallic bands around their legs, nearly identical to the tag he had found on his own bird only weeks earlier. Tucked behind the photo was an index card with a string of numbers that looked more like inventory codes than anything a hobby farmer would use. Mark turned the card over in his hand, studying the scrawled initials CB and the faint stamp of the county office in the corner. The discovery shifted his sense of reality. He was no longer fighting over a simple violation, but walking inside a story that had begun before him, one in which his birds were not just animals but pieces of some larger, hidden inventory. Convinced that he needed outside perspective, Mark arranged to meet with an old acquaintance, a local feed supplier named Henry, who had done business with his uncle for years. Over steaming coffee in the dim back room of Henry's store, he produced the tag and the photograph, watching carefully as Henry's expression darkened. The old man leaned back, rubbed his jaw, and muttered that he had heard rumors years ago about certain animals being repurposed for behavioral testing, a program supposedly run in cooperation with county officials, but buried after a scandal no one ever explained. According to Henry, the tags were identifiers for property not meant for private hands, and anyone who ended up with such animals was encouraged, quietly but firmly, to surrender them without question. Mark pressed for details, but Henry shook his head, saying only that those who asked too many questions often found themselves tangled in problems far larger than they could manage. The warning was well-intentioned, yet it only deepened Mark's resolve, because he had already been pushed into conflict by forces that clearly wanted him to capitulate, and retreating now would mean acknowledging that his life was subject to invisible strings pulled behind office doors. Returning home, he noticed a shift in the air around his property. The coop had been disturbed again, though no birds were missing, and inside the feeder he found not grain but shredded pieces of paper, each strip carrying fragments of printed text, as though someone had run official documents through a shredder and chosen his yard as the place to scatter the remains. He collected the scraps and spread them across his table, piecing them together until phrases began to emerge. Transfer of custody, county behavioral division, asset management. The words chilled him because they matched Henry's warnings and seemed to confirm that his chickens were not just incidental pets but categorized assets within some bureaucratic system. If that were true, then the HOA was not merely inventing violations to harass him, but actively assisting in reclaiming property that, at least on paper, did not belong to him at all. The realization struck him with equal parts dread and clarity. The midpoint of his struggle had arrived, the moment when he could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. He spent hours poring over county records, using parcel numbers and property codes to trace anything connected to his uncle's land. At first, the search yielded nothing beyond tax receipts and maintenance notes, but then he stumbled upon a line item buried in an old assessor's document. Livestock Exclusionary Covenant waived per agreement, 1998. The phrase suggested his uncle had once negotiated special terms that perhaps allowed him to keep animals that others could not, and that exception might have been the reason the association had watched his property so closely for so many years. He tried to request a copy of the agreement, but the clerk at the county office told him the file was sealed, marked as restricted due to administrative confidentiality. When he pressed, the clerk lowered her voice and said that the records had been transferred to an archive maintained jointly with the sheriff's department, and if he wanted access, he would need written authorization from a ranking officer. It was then that the threads began to pull together in his mind: the missing hen, the stamped eggs, the official insignia in the box, the name Wallace that did not exist among residents but might exist in county payroll. The sheriff's department was not an outside observer but a participant, and the HOA served as its neighborhood extension. That night, lying awake with the scattered scraps of shredded documents on his table, Mark felt the shape of his world alter. His chickens, creatures he had considered companions, were now evidence of something broader, a program hidden in plain sight, and by refusing to give them up he had stepped into a conflict that spanned beyond bylaws and fines. The midpoint was not a revelation that solved his problems but one that expanded them, revealing that the rules he thought he was fighting were only the visible surface of a system designed to absorb resistance and erase dissent. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he could not shake the conviction that his uncle had known all along, and that his own inheritance had never been just a house but a place already marked, already watched, and already woven into the fabric of someone else's control. The days that followed carried with them the kind of tension that clings to the air even when nothing visible is happening, and Mark began to realize that the real weapon the HOA and whoever backed them wielded was not direct confrontation, but the relentless drip of intrusion that blurred the line between his home and the control of strangers. One morning, he walked out to find a bright yellow stake driven into the ground at the edge of his yard, a laminated sheet attached declaring "Notice of Pending Enforcement," with a deadline written in red marker as though the usual typed precision had been abandoned in favor of something more menacingly personal. And when he pulled it up and carried it to the trash, he saw that the soil around the post had been disturbed as though someone had spent more time than necessary planting it, leaving behind not only the stake but the impression that they had lingered on his property long enough to mark territory that was no longer his alone. That evening, as dusk fell, he noticed that two of his hens were restless, pacing near the gate as if agitated by something beyond the fence, and when he followed their gaze, he saw the silhouette of a car idling with its lights off at the far end of the cul-de-sac, unmoving, its presence unacknowledged by anyone else on the street. Mark's attempts to fight back with logic grew increasingly futile, for every time he tried to contact the association for clarification, he was met with silence, misdirection, or form letters that contradicted one another, and when he called the county office to request copies of the restricted agreements connected to his uncle's property, the clerk curtly told him his file had been flagged for administrative hold and could not be released. In frustration, he sought help from a property lawyer, a measured man named Stephen Rowe, who listened carefully as Mark laid out the story, spreading the violation letters, the shredded documents, and the photograph of the tagged birds across the table like evidence in a case. Rowe frowned, admitting that the situation smelled less like a simple bylaw dispute and more like collusion between local governance and law enforcement, but he warned that pursuing the matter in court would require time, money, and a willingness to withstand intimidation tactics that would likely grow worse before they improved. Mark agreed to retain him, scraping together funds from his dwindling savings, because by now the matter had become less about the birds themselves and more about resisting a pressure that sought to break him. Almost immediately after that meeting, retaliation escalated. His mailbox was forced open and left dangling, the hinge bent, and inside he found not mail, but a folded photocopy of a county inventory sheet listing avian units, classification, behavioral, with several lines blacked out, the redacted marks A, deliberate reminder that he was seeing only what they wanted him to see. The following day, as he returned from picking up supplies, he found his back gate swung wide, though he had locked it that morning, and in the dirt were shoe prints too large to be his, leading directly to the coop. The birds were unharmed but unsettled, fluttering nervously when he approached, and on the roof of the coop someone had left a small plastic badge, the kind clipped to a lanyard, its photograph cut away but the name strip reading simply, Wallace. He turned it over in his palm, the confirmation of the ghost complainant's existence landing like a blow to the gut, and though it gave him the proof he had long suspected, it also told him that whoever Wallace was had been inside his yard, bold enough to leave behind a calling card without fear of the consequence. The pressure began to seep into his daily routines, eroding the fragile sense of normalcy he had tried to preserve. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and when he passed Linda Harper on the sidewalk, she smiled too brightly and commented that she hoped he was finding the adjustment to community living smooth, her tone sharp with mockery. That night his lawyer called to inform him that a complaint had been filed with the County Animal Control Office claiming his birds were diseased and posed a public health hazard, though no inspection had yet been scheduled. It was clear that the strategy now was to layer accusation upon accusation until he could no longer keep up, drowning him in a tide of alleged violations that would make resistance impossible. Yet rather than retreat, Mark felt a grim determination settle over him, because the more they pressed, the clearer it became that this was not simply about chickens, but about establishing dominance, proving that the association and its hidden allies could dictate the boundaries of private life without challenge. In the quiet hours before dawn, he began keeping a journal, documenting each intrusion, each note, each sign of tampering, as though he were compiling a record not just for legal defense but to remind himself that these events were real and not the product of fraying nerves. Still, the psychological weight pressed harder. One morning, he discovered that the feeder had been filled not with grain but with small, white stones, placed deliberately so the birds would peck uselessly at them, and beside it lay another note typed in block letters. Compliance is safety. That night, he lay awake listening for the sound of tires on gravel, of doors closing softly in the dark, and when the silence became unbearable, he walked out onto the porch and stared at the coop, illuminated faintly by the moon, a solitary structure that had become the focal point of a battle he did not choose. He thought of his uncle's cryptic warning scrawled years ago, the phrase about people wanting only what they could use, and he began to suspect that the association's endgame was not to punish him, but to reclaim the birds themselves, whatever hidden value they carried. The second escalation had arrived with quiet precision, each step designed to strip him of certainty and drain his resolve. And though he had enlisted legal help and gathered fragments of proof, he understood that the real fight was only beginning. For those who moved against him were not faceless clerks, but people who walked the same streets, who passed him with polite nods, who sat behind desks with official seals, and who believed, perhaps rightly, that their power would outweigh his defiance. The breaking point came not with another letter or a silent threat, but with the sudden intrusion of authority, the kind that arrived in daylight so the entire street could watch, because late one Friday morning Mark heard the heavy knock on his door, and opened it to find two deputies standing stiffly on his porch, their uniforms pressed and their faces carefully neutral. Behind them, parked at an angle that blocked his driveway, was the sheriff's own vehicle, and leaning against it with arms crossed was Sheriff Daniel Wallace himself, a tall, broad man whose presence seemed to fill the space with deliberate weight. The deputies informed Mark that they had received an official complaint regarding unregistered animals, that they were authorized to inspect the premises, and that refusal to cooperate could result in immediate seizure. Mark demanded to see the paperwork, and one deputy produced a sheet stamped with the sheriff's insignia. But when he read it closely, he saw that half the text was blurred, copied poorly, and that no judge's signature appeared at the bottom. He turned toward Wallace, who met his gaze with a calm expression that contained not a trace of apology, only the quiet assurance of someone who expected obedience. Mark led them toward the coupe, his hands clenched in fists at his sides, the humiliation of being paraded across his own yard under the eyes of curious neighbors burning hotter than anger itself. When they reached the enclosure, one deputy swung the gate open and began counting the birds aloud, pausing when he reached two hens with the metallic tags around their legs, the same tags Mark had discovered earlier. The deputy glanced toward Wallace, who nodded once, and then announced that these particular animals were classified as property of the county and would be removed immediately for transfer. Mark stepped forward, blocking the coupe door, and demanded to know on what grounds they could claim ownership of creatures he had raised and cared for, creatures that had lived on the property long before any complaint. Wallace's voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He explained that the birds had been misplaced years earlier during an experimental program, that they had never legally belonged to Mark or his uncle, and that their presence here constituted unlawful possession. The words were clinical, but the implication was devastating. His entire fight, the fines, the harassment, the endless notices, had been not about neighborhood aesthetics but about retrieving what the sheriff had always believed was his to reclaim. The standoff stretched into silence, the deputies waiting for instruction, Mark refusing to move, until finally he pulled from his back pocket the small folder he had been carrying for weeks, the shredded documents he had pieced together, the photograph from his uncle's desk, the inventory sheet left in his mailbox. He thrust them toward Wallace, his voice shaking not with fear but with fury, declaring that if they tried to take anything from his yard he would make the contents public, that he had already made copies stored off-site, that people outside this closed circle would know that law enforcement had been running covert programs through the facade of a suburban association. For the first time, Wallace's composure faltered, his jaw tightening as he realized that Mark had gathered enough fragments to expose a truth that was never meant to surface. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Mark could hear, and said that he had no idea what kind of storm he was inviting, that once certain things were spoken aloud they could not be taken back, and that people above both of them would ensure silence one way or another. Mark did not flinch. He told the sheriff that silence was the weapon that had already poisoned this neighborhood, that he had inherited not just a house but a history of intimidation, and that he would not let the same pattern consume him. The deputies shifted uneasily, waiting for orders, but Wallace finally raised a hand and told them to stand down. Without another word, he turned back toward his vehicle, the message clear in the deliberate slowness of his retreat. The fight was not finished, only postponed, and Mark had forced him to yield in public, which was something men like Wallace did not. Forgive. The deputies followed, and soon the vehicles pulled away, leaving behind a street buzzing with whispers from behind curtains. Mark stood in the yard, his body trembling, knowing that what had just happened was less a victory than an escalation into territory where rules no longer applied. Yet it was also the first time he had forced his adversary to blink, the first moment when the imbalance of power had shifted even slightly in his favor. And in that fragile moment of reprieve, as his chickens rustled nervously in the coop, he understood that the true climax of this struggle was not the confrontation itself, but the fact that he had dragged hidden authority into the open, exposing it to the daylight where even silence could no longer protect it. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the neighborhood seemed to breathe differently, as though the very air carried the tension of a wound that had not yet healed, and Mark found himself moving through each day with a heightened awareness of eyes on him, of conversations that ended abruptly when he passed, of the silence that followed him even into his own yard. Yet in that silence there was also a subtle shift. The yellow enforcement stakes that had once appeared overnight were gone. The mailbox stood untouched, and no new letters arrived. The HOA held a meeting that month without Linda Harper at the head of the table, her resignation explained away with the polite euphemisms of personal reasons, and though no one said her name aloud, everyone in the room seemed to understand that the carefully polished order of the association had cracked. Mark attended only briefly, standing in the back, observing the unease of people who had once spoken with the confidence of untouchable authority, but now fumbled with words, their certainty punctured by the knowledge that their reach had been challenged and that not every resident was willing to bend quietly. At home, the chickens resumed their simple rhythm, scratching and clucking as though the battles waged around them had never mattered, and sometimes Mark envied that innocence. Still, when he looked at the two birds with the metallic tags around their legs, he felt the same unease coil in his chest, because they were reminders that his fight had not been about bylaws or noise complaints, but about something larger, something still unspoken. He considered giving them away, distancing himself from the weight they carried, but each time he thought of it he remembered the quiet threat in Sheriff Wallace's eyes, and realized that surrendering them would mean conceding not only the animals, but the principle that his life could be rearranged by others' hidden designs. So he kept them, and each morning when he scattered feed, he felt both defiance and caution in equal measure, knowing the reprieve might not last. The neighbors eventually began to speak to him again, cautiously at first, then with more warmth, and one evening an older woman from down the street left a jar of preserves on his porch with a note that read simply, "Not everyone agrees with them." It was the closest thing to solidarity he had received, and though it did not erase the weeks of fear, it reminded him that power built on intimidation is never as solid as it appears. He did not imagine himself a hero, only a man who had refused to bend, and in that refusal he had found a measure of dignity that no fine or letter could erase. When autumn came and the leaves turned brittle gold across the lawns, he sat on his porch in the fading light, listening to the soft murmur of his flock, and told himself that whatever storms still lingered in the distance, for now he had reclaimed his place, and that was enough.